any determination of torture. Where, Lord Parker asked, does hardship and discomfort end, and for instance, humiliating treatment begin? And where does the latter end and torture begin? The answer, he said, turns on what he called, with great prescience, words of definition, and thus opinions will inevitably differ. Next, adaptable. In the 40 years since its discovery, the agency's psychological paradigm has proved surprisingly adaptable, with each sustained application, as we will see, producing innovation. Third, seductive. For the perpetrators and the powerful who command them, torture has, I think, a darkly erotic appeal. Even when torture is initially intended for a few Soviet spies or a few top terrorists, it soon spreads uncontrollably, pathologically in two directions: rapid proliferation to the torture of the many, and an almost uncontrollable escalation in the scale of brutality. So seductive is torture's appeal that the powerful will always concoct rationales to preserve their prerogative of torture in defiance of all evidence of ineffectiveness and in defiance of evidence of very high political costs. Finally, destructive. Although seemingly less brutal than physical methods, the CIA's no-touch torture actually leaves searing psychological scars. Victims often need years, decades of treatment to recover from a trauma that many treatment experts consider far more crippling than physical pain. Step 2, phase 2, propagating the paradigm. After codification in the 1963 Kubark Manual, the CIA spent the next 30 years propagating these torture techniques within the U.S. intelligence community and among anti-communist allies across Asia and Latin America. In a 1983 training manual, for example, the CIA taught the Honduran military interrogators that they should, quote, manipulate the subject's environment to create intolerable situations to disrupt patterns of time, space, and sensory perception. In short, a total assault on the sensory pathways to the existential platform of human identity. The techniques in this 1983 manual seem strikingly similar to those outlined 20 years earlier in the Kubark Manual and those that would be used 20 years later at Abu Ghraib. Now, when the Cold War came to a close in 1990, Washington resumed its advocacy of human rights, ratifying the UN Convention Against Torture in 1994 that banned the infliction of severe psychological and physical pain. Now, on the surface, the United States had apparently resolved the tension between its anti-torture principles and its torture practices. But when President Clinton sent this UN convention to Congress for ratification in 1994, he included language drafted 6 years earlier by the Reagan administration with 4 detailed qualifications, 4 detailed diplomatic reservations focused on one word, just one word in the convention's 26 printed pages. That word was mental. Significantly, these carefully constructed diplomatic reservations redefine torture for the United States to exclude sensory deprivation and self-inflicted pain, the very techniques that the CIA developed. This definition was then reproduced verbatim right down to the semicolons in domestic legislation enacted to give force to the UN Convention. First in Section 2340 of the U.S. Federal Code. Now, remember that number. That's the trouble with gatherings like this. You know, no blue books, no exams, nothing to wake you up and drive the points home. But just think about it, okay? 2340, okay? Now you go back to sleep and my cadences will lull you back off. Okay, 2340, we'll come back to it, okay? It's a very important number in understanding what happened, why torture is still with us. Now, in effect, as I said, Washington split the convention down the middle, banning physical torture but exempting psychological torture. A year later, in 1995, when the Clinton administration launched its covert campaign against al-Qaeda, the CIA avoided direct involvement in torture by sending some 70 terrorist suspects to allied nations notorious for brutal physical torture. This is called extraordinary rendition, and it's banned in the UN Convention, even the version as ratified by the United States. By failing to repudiate the CIA's use of torture, while adopting a UN convention that condemned its practice, the United States left this contradiction buried like a political landmine, ready to